Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining our webinar, which is Rural Transitions to Higher Education, Stories of Spaces, Misrecognition and Improvisations from South Africa by Dr. Sue Timmis, Associate Professor in Education. And Sue is in the School of Education, University of Bristol, the UK, and has researched and published widely on students' lived experiences of higher education, particularly in relation to inequalities, decoloniality, digital cultures, pedagogies, and social justice. And she was the principal investigator with Hia Duet of the ESRC Newton-funded SARIHE project on rurality and transitions to higher education in South Africa from 2016 to 2019. And Sue, you're very welcome. We've had a long collaboration over many, many years, and I really appreciate you taking the time at such a busy time of year for everybody to be with us and to talk to your presentation. So over to you, and you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Marie. It's a great pleasure to be here, virtually at least, with you. And thank you all for coming. And thank you again for inviting me, Marie. So I'm going to talk to you today about quite a large project that I've been involved with based in South Africa, which we call the SARI project. I'll tell you what that means shortly. I'm going to take a bit of a slice through it because it is a very large project, and there are many, many different aspects to it. But I hope that this will give you a sense of not only what we've done on the project, which was before the COVID pandemic, but how that might actually help us to think about issues around rurality and rural-urban divides in relation to higher education in the current day. Right, now that's interesting. It's not moving. Oh, there we are. So first of all, a quick plug for our book, which came out in 2021. So if you're really interested, I've put a link up at the end. But a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is coming from the book. And you'll see that the book was co-authored. It's not an edited book, it's a co-authored single manuscript by 8 of us. And that in itself is a story to be told sometime, but probably not now, although you can ask me about that in the question time if you want to. But the subtitle of it is Decolonial Perspectives. And so I just wanted to start by just reminding you, if you're aware already, or if you're not aware, to just give you a bit of a sense of what we mean by decolonial perspectives, because this will inform the talk that I'm giving. So Ndlovu Gatshini talks about a constant overvaluing and placing of high esteem on everything European at the expense of centuries of African indigenous wisdom. And so here he's talking about coloniality. We hear a lot about decolonization, but coloniality and decoloniality are really the sort of current terms that people who are very much engaged in critiquing universities and other institutions are employing. And the reason for that is because decolonization is really the process of removing particular structures that are in place. But that doesn't remove the historical and cultural legacies of those colonial times. And this is particularly the case in South Africa. And so we can think of decoloniality as ridding ourselves of undemocratic, post-colonial, neo-colonized mindsets about knowing, knowledge, and understanding the world. And this idea of different kinds of knowledge and how knowledge is understood is also something that underpins our study in South Africa and underpins a lot of the thinking around decoloniality that's currently going on both in South Africa but globally. I also just wanted to highlight that this talk is also framed by some ideas from social justice, particularly Nancy Fraser's concept of participatory parity as a key element of social justice, where all members of society need to interact with one another as equals. And from that, she talks about both redistribution and recognition as two elements to social justice that can bring about participatory parity. And this idea of recognition is also quite important in the study that we've been looking at, where marginalized students are often misrecognized or unknown or unseen. And we'll come back to that later on. So just a bit of background really on spatial inequalities, because we're really talking about students from rural areas in South Africa in this project. And so rural-urban divides and gaps between the rural and the urban populations are really important. The World Bank has highlighted that those kinds of gaps have increased over time, and I would imagine probably since the World Bank study in 2018, it's increased further. And just thinking about this term rurality, it's often seen in quite a deficit, negative way as urban's other, rather than actually something which is productive and generative in itself. So there are a number of people who've talked about rurality being seen as associated with traditionalism, disadvantage, and even backwardness. In our study, we embraced a much more positive and generative and dynamic understanding of rurality as something that is related to geography, but also related to culture and space and politics, of course. UNESCO has also highlighted that students from rural area are actually a forgotten group in higher education. They have not been recognised in widening participation discourses and policies. And so this report that came out in 2020 was very welcome in highlighting the need to focus more on students coming from rural areas. And equally, since COVID, there's been a lot of people writing about how educational inequalities for those in rural areas have been made worse. In South Africa, there is a particular set of spatial conditions that I think it's worth being aware of. So first of all, South Africa is not a low-income country, but it is the most unequal country in the world, according to the Gini index, which measures inequality in different contexts. And although their indicator is from, I think, 2017, it is the latest one that they have. So they are still saying that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. So it's actually quite a rich country, but it has this massive pattern of inequality in terms of rural-urban areas in particular. And this manifests itself in terms of infrastructure, including digital infrastructure, which is, of course, very relevant to us in higher education. And there's slightly different indicators here. The ITU one is from the International Telecommunications Union, And they talk about 22% of the population in South Africa having a good digital infrastructure. Statistics South Africa rated that it was only 10% of South African households that had access to the internet at home. But in predominantly rural areas, and I'll talk about this map in a second, then that was even less than 1% in those what they call the deep rural areas of Limpopo, Eastern Cape, and the Northwest. So if you look at this map, this is a map of the homelands of South Africa that were created during apartheid. So homelands were created and there was mass movement of people from their existing lands into these homeland areas. And the homelands are all in these colored places on the map. So you can see that it's actually in the more far-flung areas in the main, with the exception actually of this area of Eastern Cape, which is a little bit closer to places like Cape Town and Port Elizabeth. But in general, they were the more far-flung areas and the more unproductive land. People's lands were seized, the productive lands were seized, and they were taken to these homelands. So space and spatial conditions in South Africa are a deeply political matter, and they are still suffering from the effects of apartheid. And part of this means that a lot of these areas are very remote with very poor infrastructure, and schooling in these areas is therefore very much poorer than other parts of South Africa. And that has been the case ever since democracy came in 1994 and is still the case now. So this is our project then. We call it SARI for short, but its full name is Southern African Rurality in Higher Education. The project was conducted from 2016 to 2019, and we were wanting to investigate how students from rural areas negotiated the transition from school and home to university learning and participating in university life. It was funded by the ESRC, the Research Council in the UK, the Newton Fund, which I'm not sure if anyone's heard of, but it's a fund that is supporting international collaborations. And it was also funded by the National Research Foundation of South Africa. We called it Southern African Rurality because we had links to the wider region. So we were in a network with other universities in other parts of Southern Africa, and we did some workshops with them, we did some writing with them, we did some presentations with them. And so we were able to actually find out a bit more about those contexts as well as a deeper empirical study in South Africa itself. We worked with 3 universities in South Africa, and I should say that because of this funding model, there were 2 principal investigators for the project. I was the UK principal investigator, and there was a principal investigator in South Africa, and we also had 6 co-investigators from those 3 universities and also from colleagues at Bristol and Brighton University in the UK. All of those universities had students from rural areas attending. We had an interesting time defining what we mean by rural area, because that ends up being quite a complex matrix of different indices. But in the end, what we focused on was students who lived up to the age of 16 in a deep rural area in South Africa. You can categorize areas into more like farmland areas, or what they call the deep rural areas, which, if you remember back to that map that I've just showed you, is actually one of the things that characterizes those areas. Students who worked with us on this project were commissioned as co-researchers, researching their own lives and looking at their lives both in the rural context that they've come from as they transitioned to university, and also once they got to university. So this is another map here which shows you where our students came from. The blobs represent more than one person. We haven't actually done anything about scale here, but you can at least see where all of those different students came from. And you can see that in the main, they came from these deep rural areas, these original homelands. One or two outliers here and there, but in the majority of them, particularly from the Eastern Cape and from north of Johannesburg, in this area here, which is near to Limpopo and the northwest. So we adopted a co-researcher methodology with the students. We were very aware of the need to avoid extractive research, where you go in and you research people and you take the data and you leave again with your data. We wanted to work with people, not on them. And participatory research has been called a decolonizing mode because it avoids that positioning of students as objects of research rather than as actually research collaborators. We worked with the students for approximately 12 months. There were 72 of them in all, although we did have a few dropouts over the 12 months. So I think we ended up with 65 who ran the whole course. They were from both STEM and humanities subjects. And we worked with them in a number of different ways. First of all, we did workshop sessions through over a period of 7 weeks, although not consecutive weeks. And we also gave them an iPad, and they collected data on the iPad, any data that they wanted. So this could include diary entries, audio recordings, drawings, photographs, videos, and they chose these to represent their own lives and to narrate their own lives. So they had control over what they were going to collect. Because they're multimodal as well, this actually mitigates some of the effects of writing in a second language. So that's another way in which this kind of approach could be understood to be decolonizing. They were also involved in some collaborative data analysis. We got them together for some whole day sessions to do that. Although we would acknowledge that, you know, the amount of time that you can actually spend on that in a funded research project is limited. And so when we are aware that although we're claiming that they're co-researchers, there are obviously some areas in which they were not co-researching with us. However, they wanted to do their own publication. They, at one point in one of these data analysis sessions, they asked us, so how are we going to be acknowledged in this research? And we started to talk with them about that. And they said, we want to write our own publication to send back to people in rural areas. And so we managed to get some extra money, And we supported them through this process of developing their own booklet. And we got the money to publish the booklet in all 11 official languages of South Africa. So we were really very proud of them that they wanted to do that, and that we were able to support them to do that. And you can see those on our website under publications. We also did interviews and focus groups with academics and senior managers in the second year of the project. These are just some examples from the Evernote Diaries. Evernote is an app that you can use on an iPad, and we were using the free version, which did have some limitations, but nevertheless, they were able to use it, and we were then able to collect the data from them. So you can see the kinds of things. This is from one of the workshops, but the others are actually documentary entries. We called them documentaries that they were producing. And this was taking place over a long period of time. And I think that's the important thing to remember. So here you can see some examples of the topics actually that are in our book that focus on transitions to higher education. And transitions, of course, is not just the process of getting access to the university, it's how you prepare for that, and it's what happens when you get to university. So there are a whole range of ways in which students were negotiating and improvising around this process. And I'm going to take you through some examples of that now, but just to say all these images come from the students' Evernote diaries, and they have given permission to us to use their images and their Evernote diary entries. Similarly, we have quite a large section in the book about learning at university and the kinds of things that the students were talking about and felt were important to be raised around being at university. One of the most important things was around language. So this quote down here is about the language of white lecturers, which the accents were very hard for students who had lived all their lives pretty much in a rural area to get used to. So that orientation, not just to English, but to how it is spoken, was very, very challenging. I'll show you some more examples of that now. So first of all, applying to university, one of the things that got raised a large number of times, very, very frequently, was around the digital barriers to applying to university. So a lot of the students had either no phone or just a phone in their home context. And yet the universities were all using online systems to, and apart from one of the universities, they were insisting that those students applied online. So it was very, very difficult to actually just orientate yourself. And I mean, this is 2017. Actually now phones may be a bit more able to do this, but at the time they found it very, very difficult. And they would often have to go to an internet cafe. So it says when you get to the internet cafe, you ask strangers to assist you. And this idea of strangers came up a lot because living in a rural area, you're not used to people you don't know. So even that in itself was a barrier that they had to overcome. And similarly here, this second one is about finding the forms. And they tell you the forms are there, you don't know how to use the internet. Most of the time you're in a rural area, you don't know about internet. You don't know about the fact that you can ask someone to fax you or email you. So they found the whole process very bewildering, and they often needed help. So they had quite a lot of help, interestingly, from the radio, because the radio is much more prevalent in deep rural areas than any other form of media. So the radio actually gave information about universities and when to apply, key dates, that kind of thing. And then school teachers and head teachers. So this second quote here was, she was the reason for me to be at Urban in the first place. She helped me apply using her device and her money to buy airtime for data. And there was a lot of examples of other older siblings, teachers, and church members. Church is very, the Christian church is very, very embedded in deep rural areas in South Africa. And so they played quite a big role in helping students with their applications and getting to university, or even funding them sometimes. So one of the things that was very commonly reported on was around economic and social hardships. A lot of the students were experiencing financial hardships or living in very unsafe environments. And coming from a rural area where you know everyone into an urban environment where you don't know anyone and you don't know who to trust and who not to. There were a lot of tales around people getting into difficulties. This is not actually something that is just relevant for people from rural areas, because those from urban townships also found a lot of the living environment very, very challenging. And also money was very, very short for people from those disadvantaged communities as well. So there are some similarities, but because these students were from very, very small communities, I think it was even more challenging. And then the other point, which I've made already, is about seeing the different races and hearing different kinds of voices, not being able to understand what was taught. So it isn't so much the language as the way in which that language is pronounced and taught that was particularly difficult. But the thing that they also said was that nobody ever asked them where they were from or acknowledged the backgrounds that they had. So there was always an assumption that they would be able to fit in. And a lot of literature around transitions focuses on this idea of fitting in, whereas actually these students had particular backgrounds and particular circumstances which no one was acknowledging. More issues around decoding the digital university once you get there, everything being submitted online. And the students often talked about themselves as being computer illiterate, rather than actually seeing that it was the university that wasn't supporting them adequately. They tended to make this about themselves and say, oh, it's because I'm computer illiterate, I can't do this. There was also quite a lot of talk about home and how you make your new home. And this quote is about somebody sharing with somebody who is a stranger but becomes like a sister to her, because she's never been in a room on her own before or in a room with a stranger. So that idea of home is quite important as well for these students. So the final piece that I'm just going to talk about in this section is about the funds of knowledge that the students brought with them to university from rural areas. We wanted to avoid this idea of a deficit positioning of students coming from rural areas. And one of the ways in which we did that was by asking them to tell us about the kinds of things that they did in rural areas and how they thought that these might have helped them in terms of their university learning. And this table in green is our attempt to sort of categorize the things that they were talking about. And you can see a whole host of different kinds of knowledges and responsibilities that the students had. And in this quote here, they talk about, this student talks about in primary school, children had to clean the classrooms with cow dung. And when it rained, they had to cover the holes with paper. You have to do things for yourself in rural areas. I think that's one basic thing about us as children from rural areas. So they were really very proficient in a lot of different kinds of skills and knowledges. And a lot of them talked about things that involved collaboration. For example, herding the cattle from a very young age means that you're actually involved with a group of people and you're having to work out who's going to be responsible for what. And you're ultimately responsible for this quite valuable thing, the cattle. Similarly, people were making fires, fetching forest firewood, plants, understanding plants, etc. I'm not going to go through it all, but it gives you a sense, I hope, of what they were experiencing. The other thing that came out very clearly and interestingly was they were not actually necessarily all living in one place. They were very often very mobile because families had to move for work. So many of the students talked about different homes, schools attended, languages spoken. So when we talk about students having difficulties when they get to university, it's not because they're not proficient language speakers or language learners. Quite the opposite, actually. They have lots of funds of knowledge around language that they could employ. But again, their needs were not being recognized when they got to the university. So I've just got a few slides to summarize a bit the kinds of things that I've been talking about. I'm just checking the time. I need to hurry up a bit. So first of all, this idea that I've just been talking about place-based knowledges. I think it's really important that we recognize that learning occurs across multiple lived spaces. Learning is not just what happens in the classroom or in your study room or your bedroom when you're a student, but in all kinds of situations. And so there are opportunities for us to bring local and indigenous knowledges and cultural practices from students' own experiences much more into higher education. I think decolonization programs and initiatives are recognizing this up to a point, but they're not necessarily working with rural communities or enabling students from those communities to be at the forefront of those discussions and ideas. And I just think a lot more could be done in that regard. And similarly, in accessing higher education, the challenges of poorly resourced schooling and infrastructure and online and opaque university systems are very persistent. People are still having the same kinds of challenges. This is taken, the bullet points at the bottom here are taken from a policy report we produced for policymakers in South Africa. And we should actually do some follow-up to see if any of these have been taken up. We haven't done that work yet, but we recommended that they expand recruitment from rural schools. There is very little outreach work into those rural areas at the moment from universities. And equally, there is no access and completion rate data for students from rural contexts, either nationally or institutionally collected, although maybe our policy report will have had made a difference, let's hope. And then we also talked about addressing the wide-ranging digital inequalities faced by students from rural environments, particularly this issue around online applications and then mentoring and support when they get to university. So those were the sorts of things that we were talking about in terms of accessing higher education. And finally, I just want to return to this idea of misrecognition. Being misrecognized is about being unseen and unknown, and this was a very frequent point made in the co-researchers' narratives. They felt that people weren't interested in their backgrounds or their histories, or the kinds of contexts they come from, or the knowledges that they could bring with them into higher education. Boughey and McKenna have talked about decontextualizing learners, and they argue that language is often seen as being quite neutral in higher education and decoupled from social context. So they were talking mainly about academic literacies in their paper. And they argued that this idea of decontextualized learners was a discourse that institutions were implicitly employing, and that it was about the ways in which students are then being divorced from their history, culture, and language. I think we might argue that the university as a whole can act as a decontextualized space. So through the COVID-19 pandemic, there's a lot of evidence, and Marie and I have been involved in looking at the literature during the pandemic in higher education in terms of inequalities. And there's a lot of evidence of the assumptions that were being made about the kinds of infrastructure and study contexts that people might have within their home context. Obviously, as a lot of people were sent home from university during that time. So I'm wondering the extent to which university actually acts more universally as a decontextualized space. And I'd be interested to know what you think about that. I would say that decolonizing discourses and programs need to take more account of these issues about misrecognition and decontextualization. We also need to address these increasing digital and spatial inequalities, because they came to light much more during COVID, but were very much echoed in the study that we had previously done. And finally, I think there's a wider need for epistemic reciprocity in higher education. Can we open up spaces for the recovery of agency of marginalized students? And if we did, what would those spaces look like? And finally, in the context of mass higher education, how can universities know their students and see them within their histories and contexts? So I'm going to leave you with those thoughts. Thank you very much. Here's the book plug and my contact details.
Thank you very much, Sue. That was excellent. And I'm going to hand over to David now, who'll moderate the question and answer session. So thanks, David, and thank you, Sue.
Okay.
Thank you, Sue. Would you mind just stopping your slides there, and we'll see each other more clearly. Thank you very much. Does anyone actually have a question? I know a question was posted, and from Asmita, if you'd like, or anyone else have a question that comes to the fore? whilst they're thinking about it, I have a question for you, Sue.
Okay.
And it's to do with giving the students the iPads as their digital diaries. So obviously there's this whole piece about the technology and how they interact with it, and it's completely new to them. So how did you introduce them to the iPads, and how did that actually kind of unfold in terms of their ability to engage with those and capture those virtual diaries?
Very good question. Yes. Well, we had this series of workshops, and one of those workshops was on using the iPad. I think whilst they were very unfamiliar with university systems and tethered computers, most of them did, by the end, or by the time we were working with them, they did have a mobile phone. And so they were able to use that as a way of understanding how to use the iPad. But we also had ongoing support. We had a research assistant in the UK, and part of her role was to maintain contact with the students. So if they had any issues, then she could help them. But they also had local researchers in each of the universities who could support them with that more directly. So there were actually lots of ways that they could be supported. In fact, mostly the main thing that they had an issue with was that we were using the free version of this thing called Evernote, and some of them used up the capacity that they were given, so they had to move to Google Docs. The only other thing is the ongoing issues that there are around connectivity. And when they were back in their rural home contexts, then they may not have been able to use it as much in terms, I mean, they could take photographs, but in terms of actually uploading those. So there were some issues with uploading, because we had a sort of central repository that they uploaded to. But yes, it's a good question, but they seemed very eager. Of course, we would give it, that was their thank you for being involved in the project, that they could keep the iPad if they stuck with us all the way through. So, you know, they were actually very keen on learning to use the iPad. And I mean, I think it just has a slightly different sort of resonance to a university computer.